Hi friends, my name's Chris, and this week we're tackling Boethius and the Consolations of Philosophy. We'll be talking a little bit about who he was, the setting and place, and some of the themes and topics that are covered in the book. An introduction, essentially. I hope you guys enjoy. Hi everyone, we start a new book this week, Boethius and his Consolations of Philosophy. So today we're not going to get into the book properly. What I want to do is just talk a little bit about who Boethius was, why he wrote this book, the significance of the book, and then the setting under which this book was written, the kind of like the time and place which this book was written, kind of like locate it in history a tiny bit. And then I'll also talk a little bit about the main I guess, themes or things that are brought up in the book, things that are useful to kind of keep in mind for when we get into reading it and for when we get into the next week's book clubs and all that. So essentially, starting off, introducing Boethius and who he was. So Boethius was born into the fall of the Roman Empire. He was one of the last generations to receive what we might call like a Roman education. One of the last generations to have these Roman ideals instilled in them. He was fortunate enough to be born into a very aristocratic, very well-off, prestigious family, one that worked, at high up levels of public service and of government within Rome while it was still a thing. And so he was never, hungry, or he was never with poor education or with any of his needs unmet. He was fortunate enough to have absolutely everything a child could want growing up. He received the best type of education you could ask for. He'd read all of the classic literatures at the time, like Homer's and the Odysseys and all that type of stuff. He was well studied in Platonic philosophy. He read Epictetus, definitely Aristotle, and he valued all of this very, very much. He was a proper philosopher in that sense. He made it his life mission. The Middle Ages it was all clearly a time of like turmoil and a lot of change with different kingdoms kind of vying for power left, right, center. And he didn't want Greek philosophy to get lost, to get kind of like hidden under all the rubble. So he took it upon himself to translate a lot of the classical texts, the texts that we pore over now, like Aristotle's metaphysics or Nicomachean ethics or the Platonic dialogues. He wanted to translate all of these from ancient Greek into Latin so that they could be appreciated by everyone in the coming years. He was alive around 800 years after all of these a lot of these Greek philosophers, and so he was a man of blessed fortune, I guess. He was lucky enough to not only have a great upbringing and great education, but to be married to a beautiful wife whom he loved, and he had two beautiful sons who he was very, very proud of and who achieved a lot of recognition. They made their way up to the consul level in the government at the time, or in the kingdom at the time. And so he, at face value, from the outside, it would look like this guy had everything you could ask for. He was very, very fortunate in that sense. And so where this all kind of takes place is, as I kind of mentioned, at the end of the Roman Empire, the collapse of Rome. Rome had kind of like splintered off, and everyone was running in different directions, and you had the barbarians in the north kind of coming down and taking control. You had the Ostrogothic kingdom kind of like consolidating power around modern day Italy, and the Visigoths in Spain and France consolidating power over there. You also had the Vandals, where you get the word vandalism from, down south, and Carthage. So a lot of moving parts, basically, at the collapse of this Roman Empire. And he kind of like took it upon himself to translate all of these classic Greek texts into Latin, one of the more commonly spoken tongues at the time, or common languages at the time. And he saw it as a very urgent task, so that's kind of what he set his life goal to be. And so this is kind of where it took place, or where all of this takes place. The unfortunate reason that I think that this book is as famous as it is today is under the conditions which it was written. So obviously, I won't get into like the details, and nor do I even know the details very well, but he was very sympathetic to imperial ideals. And the king at the time, the Ostrogothic king Theodoric, he didn't like this, and he was growing more and more paranoid that the people in his inner circle were going to, commit treason, or they were going to conspire against him or something like that. And so Theodoric, growing paranoid, he turned on many of his Roman administrators. And Boethius was one of these people that was accused of treason, of conspiring against the Ostrogoths. Not only that, I think he was also charged for sorcery. So there was basically throwing all the charges against him. And this is very like it's so much of a parallel between like the things that Socrates had to go through, being charged for impiety, and for corrupting the youth. And now all of a sudden it seems to be happening again. Another academic is being accused of treason on no real grounds. He was taken from his home almost immediately, with only a little chance to say goodbye to his wife and kids, and thrown into a prison cell and sentenced to death. And so it was in this prison cell that Boethius began to write the Consolation of Philosophy. Um, Everything was stripped from him. His wealth, status, family, everything was stripped in an instant. Over the course of a night, he lost absolutely everything. And so what did he turn to during this time, was philosophy. That's why it's called the Consolation of Philosophy. He was bludgeoned to death. It's not really exact, it's not specific how, but he was definitely tortured and then bludgeoned to death. Um, and that's all we know of him afterwards. So the reason this is an important text, like historically speaking, I guess, is that it was a bridge between classic Greek philosophy and the philosophy of the Middle Ages. It held on and preserved to a lot of the Platonic ideals, or the Stoicism that a lot of the Greeks held, these Aristotelian ideas, and transmitted them into the ever more Christian Middle Ages. And it's interesting because Boethius was a Christian himself, and you don't always see Christians endorsing this type of Neoplatonism or this type of Stoicism. So for that reason, he's often called like the Christian Stoic, and we'll get into a lot of discussion of how you can make these two views compatible and all that type of stuff, and what he discusses in the book properly. But this book this meditation wants to depart a little bit from the abstract and messy philosophy of the Middle Ages. And it wants to kind of like go back in time a little bit to the practical, true, and real life philosophy of Greece, of ancient Greece. It wants to deal with questions of what it means to live, what it means to die. Really, really basic questions like how a just person can suffer. Why do bad things happen to good people? Something that everyone asks themselves growing up. And so this is an example of philosophy being put to the test, to the max. It's oftentimes philosophy is referred to as something that is pretty useless, or just something that white guys in their corner just kind of think about and stroke their beards. But this example of him having to turn to philosophy, knowing that he's going to be executed, is like one of the most real and important things that you can kind of consider and meditate on. And so it was under these conditions that he turned to philosophy, and he saw, well, I'm going to die. How can I make meaning of all of this? And so in the text, the protagonist, or one of the main protagonists, is who he calls Lady Philosophy. And Lady Philosophy is this figure. It's like philosophy embodied. Um, and yeah, she takes a woman's form. And they're taken from the book. It says, "There appeared standing over my head a woman's form, whose countenance was full of majesty, whose eyes shone as with fire, and whose power of insight surpassed that of all men." Looking at philosophy as something almost supreme, almost divine. Looking at philosophy like a guiding light or like a source of wisdom. So Lady Philosophy takes on this role of like a teacher, trying to guide and trying to advise Boethius during these last days of his life, or during these last months of his life. In the traditional world, I think it's important to kind of keep in mind that a long time ago, before philosophy was writing 20-page papers of logical arguments and of scholars bickering back and forth on like tiny technical distinctions, um, philosophy was something that was really practical and like baked into everyday life. It was urgent to everyone. It was a tool that everyone had at their disposal and that was taught to use in a pragmatic way. Um, and I think that it's because of this utility, because of this pragmatic quality that it had, that's why Boethius turned to it during these times, as opposed to perhaps other more abstract concepts like faith in Christianity. This is just me speculating, but it's interesting to see that it was philosophy he chose to kind of like turn his view at. And so um, one of the big things that Lady Philosophy kind of brings down and starts to talk to Boethius about is this concept of fortune, or of fortuna. The Romans had this god of fortune, this goddess Fortuna, who basically was like the god of randomness and the god of chance. Depending on her mood, on how she was feeling on any given day, she would dictate the random events of the earth. Maybe she would kind of allow there to be a drought in one place and then a bountiful harvest in another. Um, whether or not there was going to be lightning struck down on one part of the earth, whether or not your son was going to die of disease, um, whether or not war would break out. All of these things that we thought were kind of random, or that we attribute randomness to, was this goddess of fortune. And so there's this concept of fortune and of randomness, um, that Lady Philosophy wants to introduce to Boethius. And to say, well, let's look at your life. Let's look at everything you had and see how much of it was actually fortune, or goddess of fortune, this wheel of fortune, and how much of it was under your control. And so what fortune controls? Fortune controls all of our relationships. Who you love depends largely on who you come across, among who shows up to work that day and who you end up meeting, among who pops up on your Tinder for you to swipe on, among who's born at the same time as you. Romantic love is fickle in that way. It's very dependent on randomness. And what's more is that anyone you love can die at any second, and it can change. So romantic love, out the window. You don't control this type of stuff. Same thing with family. You don't choose which family you're born into. You're just kind of born into it. That's completely random. And so Lady Philosophy here is saying, well, your wife was in control of, or fortune was in control of your beautiful wife. Fortune was in control of the family you were born into. Fortune was also in control of the children you had. And the next one being wealth and prosperity, all the money you had, all of that stuff can just be taken away overnight in a big financial crash, your business burning down or collapsing, all this type of stuff. It's not yours in the way you usually think it's yours. You don't have as much control over these things as you'd like. Even reputation, the opinions of other people, these things are super delicate and fickle. No matter how good and principled of a man Boethius was, these charges of treason destroyed his reputation. All of his power was stripped from him, both political and academic. Even health, even just being healthy, or being young, all of these types of things, you're not in control of them as much as you'd like to think. Just because you decide to exercise and eat well doesn't guarantee that you're going to be healthy. It very well could be the case that tomorrow you get a cancer diagnosis. And who's in control of that? Well, fortune, the goddess fortune. So Lady Philosophy is warning and telling, or not warning, but kind of educating Boethius and saying, well, all of these things that you were relying, or all of these things that you thought were making your life perfect, making your life happy, they weren't in your control. It was fortune controlling them. All of this stuff was on loan to you. It was never yours. And so what's the solution? Well, hello, Stoicism. I'm sure anyone who's a little bit into like philosophy will be familiar with Stoicism. Lady Philosophy encourages Boethius to look into his inner citadel. A fortress, like an inner fortress that only he has access to and fortune cannot, get into or mess with. If you're in possession of yourself, you will possess something you would never wish to lose, and something fortune could never take away. Happiness cannot consist in things governed by chance. So Lady Philosophy here, she's saying, the big mistake you made, Boethius, was in deriving your happiness from external things, from family, friends, love, status, and so on. We need to redefine happiness, or have happiness come from this inner citadel. Well, what can be in this inner citadel? Phenomenology, the experience we have of things. No one can touch that. The fact that the screen is blue in front of me, like that's mine. The sense of self that I have, the sense of me, that's mine. My memories, those are mine. They cannot be messed with. Well, you could probably make arguments that they can be messed with, but our values and our virtues, our capacities to reason, all of these things can kind of be stored in our inner citadel, and they're fortified and protected. And if we can derive happiness from these internal things, then that's probably the right way to go about life, because we don't want happiness to be some random thing that just depends on whether or not the goddess fortune felt like being nice today, or woke up on the right side of the bed, or whatever. Lady Philosophy here is saying that the true philosopher, the good philosopher, is someone who rises above all of this type of fortune, all of this type of noise, and someone who can understand their place in the face of the cosmos and understand that their inner citadel should be the root of any type of fulfillment or happiness that they get. And so I guess the form that this book takes is in diagnosing the error. The Boethius, you've gone wrong in having your happiness depend on external things like friends, loved ones, children, career, so on. That was the mistake off the get-go. Fortune doesn't care about, the universe doesn't really care about whether or not you get the promotion or whether or not you get thrown into a cell. It would be like getting angry at fortune would be like getting angry at the rain. It seems like nonsensical. It's like a gambler getting mad at the dealer. Well, what did you think was going to happen? You were either going to lose or win. It wasn't really up to the dealer themselves. The cards were already kind of random in that way. What you need to do, the prescription, I guess, from Lady Philosophy, the medicine to this issue, is to redefine happiness. And the Stoics called this eudaimonia, this sense of like fulfillment or contentness, something that we can that we only need our inner citadel for. you can also cash it out as some sort of like activity of the rational mind. So to be able to kind of think, that should bring about enough contentness and happiness for you to live on. And interestingly, he starts to talk about, or it comes into the discussion, this idea of divine providence, or of this ascent of souls. And for any of you who've read Plato, a lot of these kind of things start to come up again. This theory of forms, this ascent of soul, the doctrines of recollection, maybe more like a metaphysical view, on what the soul consists in, or what I don't know if I'm articulating myself well here, but how to make sense of all of the randomness in the world, how to make sense of Lady Fortune, how to make sense of my place in the cosmos, and so on. And so overall, I guess this book is kind of tackling why good people suffer, how to die, how to live, and using philosophy as a tool for a practical goal, for like a very real goal, in your face goal, not for debating whether or not Pegasus exists and in which way Pegasus exists. No, that's far too abstract. That's not good philosophy, would say Boethius. Philosophy must be a bit more practical. Another really interesting thing about this book that I guess we'll probably talk about a lot is that it seems to be compatible with Christianity, but some people, there's a lot of argument, I guess, between whether or not this actually is compatible, because he's agreeing on views such as like the doctrine of recollection, which clearly isn't compatible with certain doctrines in Christianity. And essentially, yeah, I guess on the slide there you can see all the people that took from him his influence and legacy. Aquinas, Dante, in the Divine Comedy. Some people take the Divine Comedy to be like the elaboration of this Consolation of Philosophy, but why it still matters, I guess. I think this book is one of the more like practical books, I guess, if you're going to engage with philosophy. One of the more like practical, how to live a good life, uh, how to think about living a good life, uh, something along those lines, because it reminds us that our happiness, if it is something that is dependent on externals, like who we love, our careers, reputations, da-da-da-da, if it depends on that stuff, then we need to accept that our happiness is a gamble, and that at any moment, fortune can wake up on the wrong side of the bed and take it all away from us, like they did to Boethius. And so the proposal is a quite radical one, and I'm interested to hear on like what you guys think on whether or not this is reasonable or not. But the proposal is that either we redefine happiness or in some way locate it within the inner citadel, within our own concept of self, within our capacities to reason, within our phenomenology, things that fortune can't touch, things that fortune can't take. So I guess if there's anything to take from this little introduction, is that fortune is really delicate and really fickle, and at any time it can flip our lives upside down. But this shouldn't be a reason to kind of get upset. Boethius, from this writing, he was meditating in the jail cell, and one would hope that he died with some amount of dignity, because he realized that there were some things, like his sense of self, that no matter how reckless fortune got, there was some things that still remained within his power. Like a very stoic idea, I guess. Things like learning, reason, pursuit of understanding, once you get them, or if you spend your life trying to get at them, fortune can't really take them away, at least not as easily as everything else. Um, and finally, that philosophy can be really, really practical. It seems like philosophy was the most practical thing that Boethius could have had in that prison cell. Um, at the time, it's what probably let him keep his sanity and keep some peace. That's all I had, basically. Um, I hope you guys join us for next week's book club. It'll be covering books 1 to 3 of this. And yeah, excited to hear what you guys all have to say. Sweet. So thanks. Bye.